We'll jump in right into the next session, which is called The Future of Ethical AI and Technology. That's a topic that we've actually spent quite some time on here at Copenhagen Fintech Week. We actually kicked off the week Monday with a little pre-event around that. So we're super happy and proud to be able to present for you the next speaker. We have been quite active in bridging the Canadian and Ontario to the Nordics, and the next speaker actually just became VP of AI Engineering at CIO at the Vector Institute. Before that, Ron Bodkin was leading responsible AI and industry AI for retail and public health in the Google Cloud CTO office. Ron sponsored AI innovation experiments and worked with Google Product Management and engineering to develop AI and analytics products, co-innovating with customers, and was the technical executive sponsor for key customers working with Google Cloud. So, no doubt that we have a very, very experienced guy here on our virtual stage. Without further ado, I think I'll hand over the virtual mic to you, Ron, and let you take the scene.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me do this. Looks like I have to restart to share my screen. So let me jump right back. Okay, great. Certainly it's a pleasure to be here. And as in the introduction, I've just started a new role here in Ontario, leading AI engineering and computing at the Vector Institute, which is part of Canada's national strategy for fostering AI. So we have a faculty of dozens of top researchers in the AI field, associated hundreds of graduate students, and a growing technical staff. And my role in engineering is really about how do we translate that research into beneficial applications. I'm also engineering lead at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute, which is focused on the role of technology and society. And the collaboration between Vector and Schwartz-Reisman, a key area is indeed thinking about responsibility and ethics. So let me in the talk here today go through for you a few things. One is, first of all, the opportunity, why we think AI can be so powerful and beneficial in society. Indeed, I think a lot of key problems that we face, there's a real potential to use AI to create great value. But at the same time, I think it's also important to look at, what are the areas where there's been harm, right? And I think a lot of times when people think about the risks, the damage that AI might do, there's sometimes a tendency to look into the distant future, and sometimes a tendency to look in a pretty narrow way. So I want to challenge that perspective a little bit and offer a broader view of some of the short and medium term risks that I see. I do think there's long-term risk, but I think if we do a good job of addressing the immediate and more near-term risks, it will set us up better for longer-term AI safety concerns than. And certainly, I think there's a lot of work to do now. It's not a theoretical problem. So then I'll talk a little bit about practically how, as organizations, especially in financial, we can tackle responsible AI. Notably, many of the large banks here in Canada are sponsors of the Vector Institute, and so, as are a couple of large insurance companies and other financial firms. So we have a lot of engagement with financial. And prior to this, in my time at Google, I also had interaction with a lot of different financial services firms. So I see responsible AI as very top of mind in the industry. And then I'll conclude. So the first thing that I think is noteworthy is how quickly the technology is advancing. If we take deep learning as a foundation, 10 years ago, AI's research was still a relatively minor field. It wasn't nearly as hot and hadn't achieved the kind of results. 10 years ago, even on image competitions, the techniques being used were much more hand-tuned rather than systematic deep learning approaches. That's all changed in the last 10 years. We've seen, for example, just in the last few weeks, a lot of excitement over much more powerful natural language models, exemplified by OpenAI's GPT-3, where by training a massive model of 170 billion parameters, they're able to start giving it context for what to do in English language and natural language more generally, and have it do some interesting things. Now, I don't want to overstate what that is, but that potential of flexibility and deeper emergent properties of understanding is exciting, right? Similarly, in the field of development for autonomous vehicles, advances in deep learning for vision, and indeed techniques for allowing for better planning that leverage modern AI techniques are also key areas where we're seeing significant advances happening in AI. Similarly, we're seeing advances in the fields of robotics, right? Increasingly flexible robots doing more complicated tasks. In this example, a robot in an Amazon warehouse, but there are many other examples. And similarly, new products that are interacting in a useful way in speech, and again, underlying that speech interaction is natural language understanding and generation, right? So whether you're using an Amazon, a Google, a Microsoft, or an Apple device, or others like Samsung, right? That there's been a significant level of progress and improvement, and I would argue that essentially what's happened is that our machine learning models have crossed a threshold of performance that they're now useful, right? So before you could build products like this, but they were low enough quality that nobody would want to use them. Whereas now we've crossed over to a point where they've started to become useful, helpful products, and it's driving a cycle of feedback and improvement. Especially near and dear to my heart, an area where there's been a lot of work here at the Vector Institute is applying AI in healthcare, right? So enhancement of radiology to assist physicians in diagnosis of cancer, identifying the potential for a tick to have caused Lyme disease, so helping people identify if they should be worried and get a medical consultation after they've been bit by a tick, predicting cardiac arrest in a hospital setting, where researchers at Vector have been able to predict heart attacks 5 minutes in advance, and greatly improve the probability of survival by having a physician able to attend to somebody prior to that life-threatening event. Right. So those are examples. Most immediately in mind for many of us in the middle of a pandemic is, of course, how AI techniques can help. I was involved in some of these efforts previously at Google, and perhaps not surprising, Vector Institute and Schwartz Reisman Institute have been working closely with the Ontario Ministry of Health and a number of other parties around how AI can attack this threat, right? So improving detection, identifying risk factors, early warning of where outbreaks might occur, assessing the effectiveness of various techniques, and tied in with all of this, deciding where and how to allocate resources, right? And I think in the use, AI for public health has also been very much of a flashpoint between rightful concerns around responsibility, around privacy and trust, and what should be done and can be done, versus the ability to act and use capabilities to really make a difference in responding, right? And what I guess in this one area, I'd say my observation across many governments that I've observed is that unfortunately, as a society, we haven't done well in North America in terms of being able to have the trust and the data cleanliness and the right sort of models around privacy and enablement to use data to really respond and drive policy decisions. And I think that data can inform more advanced machine learning models than more traditional statistical models. But I think it's more of an area of potential, but there's still a lot of work to do in order to realize. So those are a few examples, right? There's lots of other areas where AI can affect both the benefit companies in terms of productivity, in terms of reducing drudgery for employees, and indeed in terms of using AI to address big problems like climate change, right? So there's a lot of really important areas where AI can have an effect, driving productivity, benefiting individuals, as well as addressing some thorny societal problems. So I think there's tremendous value from AI in our organizations and in society. But there's also a lot of challenges. One of the things that is top of mind, and one of the concerns that's rightly become much more prominent in the last few years, is concern about unfair bias, right? So one form of unfair bias is disparate outcomes, where individuals are, receiving a different kind of treatment based on some protected class. End of last year, there was a big fiasco over the Apple Card, where there were a number of prominent people who identified big differences in the credit offered between husbands and wives, men and women who are married, which led to investigation around, is this unfair bias on a gender basis? There was similarly last year a study at UC Berkeley showing that in mortgage applications that there was bias against Latinx and Black applicants. So about 8 basis points higher in new purchases that members of those groups experienced versus the baseline, and about 3.5 basis points higher in refis. That may not seem like a large number, a few basis points, but in aggregate in the United States, that led to $750 million of extra interest that these groups, these protected classes were paying in a discriminatory manner, which is a significant tax from a biased algorithm. And in a similar way, there is an example of Amazon created an AI system to hire people, but it was found to be discriminating against women, biased against them. In fact, they tried a number of techniques to remediate that bias, but ultimately concluded that they couldn't get it working, according to reports. Another form of bias is representational harm, right? Which is rather than a model that's sort of directly penalizing you based on a high stakes decision like a mortgage, or even the famous example of AI system in the criminal justice system deciding on who should be eligible for being released on bail. But representational harm also comes to mind, right? So not so long ago, a great example of this would be, if you went into a search engine and typed in CEO, you'd see, a battery of white men in the U.S., right? Now, I think some of the more obvious examples, for example, Google has done work to correct, but you find that it's very hard to fix it on a one-off basis, right? So I ran this search a couple days ago for mechanic. I'm here in Canada, so it's more Canadian sites, but you can see that the vast majority of individuals shown as mechanics are men, right? And in fact, everyone shown is white. So there's this where, of course, you can argue, look, there's a biased corpus of data on the internet. What's the right thing to do? But does this send a message to people who are, young people thinking about careers? If they see there's no one like me, it could be a representational harm, or somebody who is in that career feels like they're not represented. So it's a complicated issue, but it's not a trivial one to fix. And of course, there's more concerns. An example on the bottom left, recent example from a paper that was using neural style transfer to try to basically, or I'm thinking of the technique wrong. It's not neural style transfer per se, but it's a GAN-based technique where you take a fuzzy image and try to complete the image to make it look more accurate, right? And so a fuzzy image of Barack Obama is turned into an image of a white man. So clearly, the model is biased in that it prefers to complete images in a certain racial tone, right? Another example, back to language models like GPT-3, they're powerful, but as this recent tweet showed, that they were generating, they were certainly able to generate some very offensive statements, as well as controversial statements, right? And so these are examples of representational harm that AI models can produce. More broadly, more and more of the information that's being mediated in our society is being mediated through algorithms, right? Increasingly, people are getting information through recommendations, through ranked search results, through the ordering of a news feed, what topics appear and get amplified, and which ones are below the fold and never get reached in a scroll, right? And so, there's been recent controversy. Facebook. There's been a lot of criticism of their continued use and willingness to share divisive content. Of course, there's a narrative that Facebook would use to say, "Oh, well, we support free speech." But I think the best summary in my mind is freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. In other words, if you have algorithms that amplify and recommend controversial content, it's problematic, right? So there's been a lot of evidence that conspiracy theories like QAnon, Facebook groups organizing militias, that the role of Facebook in violence and conflicts in societies, through which is very much mediated by algorithms and what gets recommended in the news feed and in suggested groups is problematic, right? So these are really mediated by AI algorithms. It's far from uniquely Facebook, though. TikTok, which is very much a video sharing service that recommends based on algorithms. In a number of countries in the global south, there's been many cases observed of where lynchings are being shared and propagated through conspiracy theories and inflammatory content on TikTok. And similarly, YouTube has had a lot of challenges around conspiracy theories and around fake news and around recruiting for extremist groups, right? So in each case, right, these are all companies that are having a massive impact in the information they're sharing, and its algorithm, the AI systems they've built are mediating and forming what used to be a human editorial function is now increasingly being performed by an algorithm. And I think it's fair to say that that's having a big impact on society. It also has a big impact on individual users, right? So before you get on unethical use, you've seen behavior like a digital addiction and depression, right? That a lot of times these interactions, manipulation of people, right? These are other kinds of harms that can occur from AI, and this is the intersection of using AI techniques with design techniques like autoplay to create perhaps addictive behavior, perhaps more negative emotions or more alarming material, right? So this is an fact, but I also think it's worth noting that these concerns are not unique to the largest technology companies, but that smaller media organizations need to be thinking about this, and any consumer-facing organization needs to be thinking about how its AI algorithms are interacting with and what effects they're having on their customers and the larger community. I won't talk for long about the potential for using AI for controversial or clearly unethical things like mass surveillance of populations in totalitarian states, or the idea of autonomous weapons that will use AI to autonomously target and kill people, like this Kalashnikov gun on the left. But I think it's worth noting that there is certainly some risk of that. I mean, hopefully we all are working in ethical organizations that are opposed to such techniques. I mean, I think, I, like many, worry about the potential of an arms race of AI weapons, making it hard for countries to disarm. But we'll stay focused on nearer term issues in this talk. I also haven't touched on some of the questions around, how is AI going to affect employment? I think it's fair to say that to date, we haven't seen large-scale disruption of employment from AI systems. There's clearly a number of companies in spaces like driving and robotics that are aiming to automate significant types of work that today is being done by people. So there's a potential for a big societal impact from that. But we haven't. But it's hard to gauge timing and how that will really play out. So let's talk a little bit more about how to act responsibly. So what I would say here is I think that there's a foundation of technology, right? So building responsibility in by design and having the right tools and standards. It layered on top of it is important to have a process, governance, and inclusion, and then a strategy, which includes both, having a North Star in terms of what are your ethics as an organization and overall embracing a responsible approach to AI. One of the things I think is really important that a lot of organizations think that they can push responsibility down as a well-focused engineering problem to solve, right? Like, can you debias this algorithm and make sure, or can you certify that we're all okay? And in fact, it's more complicated because it involves people, and you need to do more than a one-off fix, right? It's an ongoing process to embrace, right? So in strategy, I would say you've got to think about what's an ethical code, right? There's a number of models. Canada, there's a responsible use of AI guidelines. European Union has written trustworthy AI guidelines, although I think they're a little more narrowly focused on the risks of AI. A Silomar conference from 2.5 years ago vocalized sort of longer term AI principles. And then there's a number of industry principles like from Google and Microsoft. But the point is not that you should adopt these, but that these can be references for your own organization's code. And then you really, of course, have to have accountability, buy-in and sponsorship by leadership, accountability for technical experts and domain experts, regulators and researchers, right? So what's the role of each and how do they work together? So often I see responsibility breaking down because there isn't clear shared ownership in an organization. From a process standpoint, I think it's important to have an inclusive process, with diversity of individuals, with a variety of disciplines, not just technical experts. Having the right level of oversight, review, and metrics that are being looked at, integration with existing processes, right? So it complements risk and security and privacy review, and having standards, and to the extent possible. Documentation is great, but where you can automate instead of having things all manually documented, it can greatly reduce the cost and increase the applicability. I also think it's emerging. I enjoyed a talk from the leader of Facebook's Red Team in terms of doing actual adversarial testing to test what can go wrong, rather than a simple review in advance. There's a lot of technology being developed. It's an active area of research, but I would say there's a lot of work on model interpretation, but I think trying to do post hoc interpretation of opaque models is much more complicated than thinking about what transparency is needed for stakeholders by design, right? So as an example, if you think about applying machine learning to identifying fraudulent behavior, thinking about what information you need to give from a deep learning model to a fraud investigator so that they can act on a suspicious case and know what to look at is not something that easily falls out of a generic, feed in structured data of time series and provide generic interpretation techniques, right? And similarly, thinking about, there's a lot of work on fairness, or how do you do analysis, what are metrics you can use, what are techniques you can use to remediate unfair bias. In a similar way, there's interesting work on privacy, both to analyze potential leakage of information, and techniques like federated learning and differential privacy that can include more privacy protection with machine learning. And I think there's a lot to do to think about from the safety community. I think work on value alignment to really think about the objectives that we're optimizing our systems for. What can we learn from techniques like inverse reinforcement learning? What can we use active learning and other techniques to not just inform what data to use as inputs, but to inform what objectives we should be using. Likewise, I think it's super important to think of multiple metrics in measuring the outcome of AI systems to think about what are the risks from a responsibility standpoint. So in conclusion, I'd say I think responsible AI is urgent, right? It's increasingly critical in organizations with the kind of harms that I've outlined. There's more awareness and concern. It's important to retain the trust of all stakeholders in an organization. It's important to prevent reputational harm, right? Nobody wants to have headlines like the Apple Card headlines from last year. It's important to unlock value from AI. So many organizations I talk to say, we don't know how to deploy all these advances in deep learning. We're going to fall back on statistical regression or gradient boosted decision trees and miss out on the value. That's important for society, right? And it requires buy-in and support by leadership and experts in the organization, as well as regulators and researchers. So I would urge everyone here to act now, take responsibility, broaden participation, increase transparency, and focus on outcomes. And I guess with that leaves us time for a question or two here at the end.
It surely does. Thank you very much, Ron. That was super interesting, and I'm very much looking forward to actually the panel debate also on this. So we have a couple of questions, and one of them is from Henrik Axelsen that asks, what do you see as the best practice tools / frameworks / tests for assessing ethical risk? Seems very difficult to upfront identify some of the great examples you have of biases.
Yeah, so I would say there's been some useful contributions in open source in this area, right? There's been a number of open source tools from Google, at least around understanding bias and more interpretation of models, right? So that you can look for tools from Google Pair, like the What If tool for doing exploration and counterfactual analysis. Indeed, tools like TensorBoard for just visualizing and slicing and faceting data can be helpful. I would say there's been a lot of interesting research on model interpretation, right? So in addition to some of the better known techniques like Shapley values that help you with understanding feature importance, I think those types of techniques around using counterfactuals or concepts or similar examples, those are all helpful. I'm more optimistic about research that includes summaries or interpretation in a model inherently, or even better, ways of controlling a model, right? So there's been some research in that, although I haven't seen as much tooling. I know IBM has also released open source tools around some of these topics that look interesting, but I haven't had as much time to look at or work with them. But I would also say that I think the reality is the tooling is still very emergent and immature, and I've seen, I think it's still a lot of times falls on using the general tools, frameworks like a PyTorch or a TensorFlow, and then having a process where individuals in the organization take the time, right? Like measuring metrics in the system is something that people are doing already, but really being thoughtful about the metrics and having a review process can be an important part of assessing and preventing risk, right? So I think we're still in more of a human process than tools-led approach.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ron.